Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. As preppers, most of us absolutely love survival gear, and there's a ton to choose from. But some of what's out there isn't worth your money. A lot of survival mainstays are just a little outdated and aren't as good as newer, more improved versions, while some pieces of gear are so bad that depending on them in a survival situation could get you killed. And during my time as a prepper, I've wasted a lot of my money on some absolute duds. So today I'm going to share those with y'all so you don't waste your hard-earned money on junk. The first piece of survival gear that you should avoid is a hurricane lantern cooker, which is basically a regular hurricane lantern that's been modified to accommodate a small pot or skillet on top of it. The idea here is to use your emergency light source as a way to cook, which actually has a lot of merit if you're short on fuel because you want to be able to do as much as you can with what little that you have. I showed this on the channel towards the end of last year, and one thing I mentioned in that video was how little heat you actually get from one of these. I couldn't even boil small amounts of water with it, and out of all the off-grid cooking methods that I've tested over the years, this has been by far the worst. Then build quality is another issue. The top of the chimney is removable so that you can replace it with the pot holder, but the way it's built, it can also slip, which makes it difficult to remove the globe or the burner. And considering that you're supposed to trim your wick regularly with one of these, that's going to get annoying real fast. Then the pot and skillet that come with it are pretty terrible. I've even read reviews online where water leaked out from the rivet that holds the handles in place, and then the handles are also pretty floppy. But I mean, I guess on the bright side, you could always use them as maracas if you wanted to. Then to make things worse, it's pretty expensive. Mine cost around 50 bucks when I got it, and the last time I checked, that price was up to $70. And when you consider that it won't even boil water and it isn't well built, that is not a great value. In my opinion, you're much better off just going ahead and getting a real camp stove. Decent options start at around $35 and then go up in price from there. Then you could use the rest of your money that you save not buying this on a decent LED lantern, and then you'd have your cooking and lighting bases covered with much better gear overall. Now, all that being said, I do think the hurricane lanterns are good to have for backup lighting in case your flashlights and LED lanterns stop working. Maybe you run out of batteries, or you can't recharge your rechargeables, or you just want to be prepared for something like an EMP. But if you're going to get a hurricane lantern, just get a hurricane lantern. Don't get one that tries to be multifunctional to the point where it doesn't do anything well. The next piece of awful survival gear is one that's been in the prepper community for decades, and we'll talk more about it here in a minute. But first I want to talk about a huge mistake that even experienced preppers make, and that's overlooking their online security. I've been using Delete Me for several months now to help keep my online information secure, and I'd like to thank them for sponsoring us today. While modern technology has made many things more convenient, it's also made protecting your privacy and OPSEC much more difficult. Some of our most sensitive information, including where we live, who we're married to, how many kids we have, and where we work, are all available to anyone who can do a simple online search. Data brokers store this and even more sensitive information and will sell it to whoever will pay for it. And it doesn't matter who it is. Criminals and stalkers can use anything that they find to harass you, steal your identity, and just make your life miserable. They could even use your online information to scam your loved ones. But you do have the right and the ability to protect that information. Delete Me will contact the different data broker websites out there and request to have your information removed. Since I've started using them, they've already removed my information from 131 listings with 27 more in progress. And a lot of that was from websites I hadn't even heard of before. After I looked at my latest report, I went online and tried to find myself, and it has gotten a lot more difficult, which I'm a huge fan of. So overall, I think it's a really good service for preppers to use, and if you want to check them out, then you can use this link and code to get 20% off. The next piece of survival gear you should avoid is hollow-handled survival knives, also known as Rambo knives. On the surface, these seem like they'd be a good idea because really, who would not want a knife with a saw on the spine and a miniature survival kit in the handle? But the problem with this is that any design that incorporates a hollow handle won't be durable, especially for a larger knife that most people would want to use for more demanding tasks, like chopping. Most knives like this have a nut and bolt connecting the handle and the blade, and it will not take much for that connection to loosen. I got this particular knife when I was in high school, and it was one of my first big knife purchases, but it didn't take me long to notice some pretty big issues. First, the sharpening stone is virtually impossible to get out of the sheath. Then, as you can see, the compass has fallen off because it was just hot glued in, and as we all know, hot glue is one of the best materials for hard-use survival gear. But the biggest issue cropped up when I tried to use it for chopping. It didn't take hardly any time at all for the blade and handle to loosen. Like you can see here, there's quite a bit of play. If I would have kept going and doing what I was doing, there's a good chance that the bolt holding them together would have eventually snapped. So if you want a larger knife that you can use for chopping or batoning, you're much better off getting a full tang knife like this Becker BK7. Its blade and handle are one continuous piece of metal with handles bolted into place, and that'll make it less prone to failure. I've used and abused this knife, and it's held up very well. Now, while it is considered full tang, its tang is skeletonized, so if you wanted to, you could store some survival or repair items inside the handles like I did on its larger cousin, my BK21 Kukri. But if you do that, you will need a way to access it, so I personally would much rather keep stuff like that in either the sheath or in a belt pouch just for ease of access. The next piece of survival gear that you should avoid, like week-old tuna that's been left out in the sun, is the credit card survival tool. And I do get the idea here, wanting to have a small multifunction tool that you can slide in your wallet, it's reasonable. But tools like this are always going to have some very serious issues. First off, the tools on it are almost all pretty ineffective. The knife blade won't even cut through cardboard, and the saw won't fare much better. Another issue with the saw is that it's so tiny that you won't be able to cut through anything you couldn't just snap with your hands. Now, to be fair, you may be able to use it to make notches for bushcraft traps or triggers, but that's about it. The only other tools on here that I think could be remotely useful are the screwdriver, the bottle opener, and then the ruler. Then the other issue with tools like these is ergonomics. This thing is nothing but squared sharp edges with a lot of burrs. If you had to hold this for any length of time, your hands would be screaming at you. Given if you had gloves, you'd fare a little better, but if things are so bad that this is your best chance of survival, you're probably not going to have gloves. The next horrible piece of survival gear to stay away from is knockoff Swiss Army knives. Now, I've always been a fan of real Swiss Army knives. I grew up around the time that MacGyver was ending, and he always had two things with him: a Swiss Army knife and a glorious mullet that I would never have a chance of pulling off. But because of that, Swiss Army knives were kind of big at the time, and all the little boys, myself included, wanted one. Now, I'm a full-grown man-child, and I haven't stopped loving them since. And even though I have a Leatherman Wave, several Becker knives, and a Spyderco PM2, I still carry my Swiss Army knife. And since I love them so much, I absolutely despise the knockoffs. Every one of them that I've seen is made from junky steel, and it's poorly put together. This means that their tools wobble a lot when they're supposed to be locked in place, and many times their knives won't take a good edge. But if by some miracle you can get one on there, it's not going to last very long. And don't get me wrong, I know that even real Swiss Army knives have limitations. They won't be able to hold up to long-term use like a full tang fixed blade will, and their tools won't be as effective as full-size versions. But they're very well built and have always worked well for me. Having this with me has saved me from having to go run and grab a screwdriver way too many times to count. And if something really weird were to happen where I literally did not have anything else, then I could still get a whole lot done with this. Another terrible piece of survival gear that can easily get you killed during an emergency is a button compass. And the big problem with most of these is that they don't point north. This one here came as part of a set with like a little cheap pocket knife and a pouch, and it almost never moves in any direction. And a lot of smaller compasses that you get with generic survival kits will be just like it. They're not fluid filled, and they're basically the same quality as what you get in a goodie bag from a kid's birthday party. Now, I have managed to find a couple of decent options if you want a smaller compass. This one's made by Swunto. I showed it in my Altoids 10 survival kit video a few weeks ago, and it actually works. Then the other one that I have here came from my Swiss Champ SOS kit. I don't know if they make them anymore, but it was basically a Swiss Army knife that came in a belt pouch with some other survival gear, including this compass, and it works pretty well. But in all reality, for most kits, like your get-home bag and your bug-out bag, a larger compass like this will do just fine. They don't weigh a whole lot, they're relatively flat, and they last a really long time. I got this one by Silva around 20 years ago, and it still works fine. The next kind of survival gear that every prepper should avoid is junky mini stoves. Now, not all mini stoves are bad. There are some pretty good ones that we'll talk about in a second, but here I have two examples of what to stay away from. This first one is something that I got on sale at a local survival shop, and after using it, I can see why they were trying to get rid of them. It's very difficult to get all the pieces to fit together, especially all at the same time. You may get the basin here in position, then set the top on, only for the base to pop right back out. And since this doesn't fit together well, it's also hard to take the top grate off if you want to extinguish your heat source, which could be pretty dangerous if you're not able to do that. The next one here would probably be okay if it wasn't painted, but the paint burns off during use and produces some really nasty fumes. It was designed to be used with Sterno-style cans, and to be fair, I was using an alcohol stove, so that may have been too much heat for it. But in all reality, investing in something like this that can only be used with one fuel source probably isn't the best idea. Stainless steel canteen and bottle cook set stoves, on the other hand, work pretty well. They don't have any moving parts, and since they're stainless steel, they can be used with an alcohol stove, fuel tablets, and even natural materials. If you're really short on money or are already in a survival situation, you can make one yourself out of an old tin can. The next piece of survival gear I'd recommend staying away from is the old magnesium fire starter, and this one definitely fits in the still works, but there's just better stuff out there category. First off, it's small and blocky, which means that it won't be comfortable to use, especially if your hands are cold and wet, and it will also be difficult to use one-handed. Another thing I don't like about these is that they're a whole lot of work for something that burns really quickly. You'll spend several minutes scraping off a pile of magnesium big enough to do anything, and then that'll all burn up in just a few seconds. Its small ferro rod also won't give you as many strikes as something larger, although it probably would be sufficient to get you through a shorter term situation. I personally would rather have a larger ferro rod and some type of fire starter. A larger ferro rod will be easier to hold on to if you're cold or wet, and it'll give you more options if you need to strike it one-handed. You could brace it against a stick, hold it in place with your foot, and then use your knife to strike it. Then, fire starters, whether you make them yourself or buy them, will burn much longer than magnesium and are ready to use when you need them. You can make these out of cotton rounds, wax, and lighter fluid, or just saturate some cotton balls with Vaseline. Then, commercially available fire starters like these mini Infernos will do the same thing. Now, if you can find these for a couple of bucks, it probably wouldn't hurt to go ahead and pick them up. But like I said earlier, I think that we have a lot better options nowadays that we can invest our money in. Then the last piece of survival gear that I'd recommend staying away from are hexamine tablets. And like magnesium fire starters, these aren't really terrible, they're just not as effective as you'd think they'd be. Now, I know that there's a lot of people out there who've been using these for decades with great success, but if you're just starting out, you need to understand that you'll probably need more than one to boil even a small amount of water. And when I say small, I'm talking about enough water to fill a canteen cup or a similar size container. You can add a lid to your container and protect the flame from the wind to help them do their job a little bit better, but always pack more of these than what you think you'll need. Another thing I don't like about fuel tablets like these is that they're toxic and they smell terrible. You absolutely should never use these indoors, and I even try to keep my distance from them when they're burning outside. Hexamine tablets are also pretty difficult to light. The easiest way I found to light them is to use a stormproof match, light it, and then set it on top. But you can grind some of it off into a powder and then use a ferro rod to light that. Now, even though these aren't my favorite pieces of gear, they do have some advantages. First, they're very stable, which means that they can be stored in less temperature-controlled environments like your car, so they're very good for kits like that. And since they're solid, you don't have to worry about them leaking and then making a horrible mess everywhere. Then they can also be used as an emergency fire starter. Say you're trying to get a fire started in less than ideal conditions. If you could get one of these lit, it'll give you a much better chance of getting the rest of the fire going, since they can burn at around 1300 degrees Fahrenheit and can last for up to 12 minutes. But even if you have gear like this that maybe isn't the best but won't get you killed, then you can salvage at least some of it by putting it in a backup survival kit. So if you want to learn about how to make what I call a better than nothing kit, then click here. Or if you want to see some of my favorite survival gear that I actually recommend, then click here. Once again, I'd like to thank Delete Me for sponsoring us today. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.